My name is Margaret Turner, though most people call me Maggie. I am 70 years old, and I have lived in the same house on Hawthorne Avenue in Portland, Oregon, for nearly 4 decades. The walls of this house have absorbed every echo of my life, my laughter, my tears, the quiet moments of hope, and the long, sleepless nights of worry. I have always believed that a home is not just a place, but a living record of the people who have loved and lost within its rooms. For me, this house is a living testament to the sacrifices I have made, the dreams I have nurtured, and the family I have tried so hard to hold together. I was never a woman of great ambition, at least not in the way the world measures it. My ambitions were quieter, more domestic, and perhaps, in their own way, more enduring. I wanted a home that felt safe, a marriage that felt true, and a daughter who would grow up knowing she was cherished. My husband, Robert, was a gentleman. He taught high school science and loved crossword puzzles and jazz records. He died far too young, leaving me with a mortgage, a 10-year-old daughter, and a heart that felt permanently bruised. I remember the day I stood in the kitchen, staring at the stack of bills on the counter, wondering how I would ever manage. But I did manage, because there was no other choice. I took a job as a secretary at a local law firm, working long hours and pinching every penny, determined that my daughter, Emily, would never feel the cold edge of want. Emily was the center of my world. She was a bright, curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. I remember the way her hair would fall into her eyes as she bent over her homework at the kitchen table, the way she would look up at me with that mixture of frustration and hope, waiting for me to explain some stubborn math problem. I was not always patient, and I was certainly not always wise, but I tried my best. I wanted her to have every opportunity, every advantage that I had never known. I scrimped and saved, denying myself new clothes, vacations, even the small luxuries that make life feel a little softer. All so that Emily could go to the best schools, wear the right shoes, fit in with the other girls. There were times when the sacrifices felt endless, when the weight of responsibility pressed so hard on my chest that I could barely breathe. I remember sitting alone in the living room after Emily had gone to bed, the house silent except for the ticking of the old mantel clock, and feeling a loneliness so deep it seemed to echo in my bones. But then I would hear her soft footsteps on the stairs, or the sound of her laughter drifting down the hallway, and I would remember why I was doing all of this. I was building a future for her, brick by brick, even if it meant losing pieces of myself along the way. The years passed in a blur of work and worry, school projects and scraped knees, parent-teacher conferences and late-night fevers. I watched Emily grow from a shy, awkward girl into a confident young woman, and I felt a pride so fierce it sometimes frightened me. She graduated from college with honors, married a man named David who seemed, at first, to be everything I had hoped for her. They moved back in with me after David lost his job, promising it would only be for a few months. That was nearly 2 years ago. Now, the house feels crowded in a way it never did before. Emily is busy with her job at a marketing firm, always on her phone, always rushing from one meeting to the next. David spends most of his days in the basement, searching for work online, his frustrations simmering just beneath the surface. I try to stay out of their way, to make myself useful without being intrusive. But it is a delicate balance. Sometimes I feel like a ghost in my own home, haunting the edges of their lives, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that holds us together. There are moments when I catch Emily looking at me with a mixture of impatience and something else, pity, perhaps, or resentment. I wonder if she remembers the nights I sat up with her when she was sick, the mornings I braided her hair before school, the years I spent making sure she never went without. I wonder if she knows how much I have given up for her, or if she simply takes it all for granted, as children so often do. I do not blame her. Not really. Life is hard, and we all carry our own burdens. But sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and wonder if I have made a terrible mistake if, in giving her everything, I have somehow taught her to expect too much. The house itself has become a kind of silent witness to our changing fortunes. The kitchen, once filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering soup, now feels cold and unused. The living room, where Emily used to sprawl on the rug with her coloring books, is cluttered with David's job search materials and stacks of unopened mail. Even the garden, my pride and joy, has grown wild and untended, the roses choked by weeds. I try to keep up with the chores, but my energy is not what it once was. Some days, I feel every one of my 70 years. Despite everything, I still find moments of peace. Early in the morning, before the others are awake, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the sun rise over the rooftops. The light is soft and golden, and for a little while, I can almost believe that everything will be all right. I remember Robert's voice, gentle and reassuring, telling me that I'm stronger than I think. I remember Emily as a little girl, her hand in mine, her eyes bright with trust. These memories are my anchor, the thing that keeps me from drifting too far from shore. But lately, there has been a tension in the air, a sense that something is shifting beneath the surface. Emily and David have been whispering behind closed doors, their voices low and urgent. I catch snatches of conversation words like nursing home and market value, phrases that make my heart race and my hands tremble. I tell myself I'm imagining things, that I am being paranoid, but the feeling persists. There is a coldness in Emily's tone when she speaks to me now, a distance that was not there before. David is polite, but his eyes slide away from mine, as if he cannot quite bring himself to meet my gaze. I try to push these worries aside, to focus on the things I can control. I bake bread, even though no one seems to eat it anymore. I tend the garden, pulling weeds and pruning roses, though my back aches and my hands are stiff with arthritis. I clean the house, dusting the shelves and polishing the silver, trying to hold back the tide of chaos that threatens to overwhelm me. It is a losing battle, but I fight it anyway, because it is all I know how to do. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts, I wonder what will become of me. I have spent my whole life taking care of others, putting their needs before my own. Now, as I watch Emily and David move through the house as if I am not even there, I realize that I have no idea how to take care of myself. I do not know what I want, or even who I am, outside of my roles as wife and mother. The thought is terrifying, and yet, like, in some strange way, it is also liberating. For the first time in my life, that I am forced to confront the possibility that I might have a future that belongs to me alone. The days blur together, each one much like the last. I wake early, make breakfast, tidy the kitchen, and then retreat to my small corner of the house. Emily and David come and go, their lives a whirlwind of activity that I can barely keep up with. I try to stay useful, to offer help where I can, but more and more often, I find myself in the way. Emily snaps at me for leaving dishes in the sink, for forgetting to buy milk, for misplacing the remote control. David sighs when I ask about his job search, his patience worn thin by months of disappointment. I tell myself they are just stressed, that things will get better. But the hope feels thin and fragile. One afternoon, as I am folding laundry in the living room, I overhear Emily on the phone with a friend. She is laughing, her voice light and carefree, so different from the way she speaks to me. I hear her say, "It's just so hard living with her. She forgets things all the time. I don't know how much longer I can do this." The words sting, sharp and unexpected, and I have to sit down to catch my breath. I did not realize I had become a burden, that my presence was something to be endured rather than cherished. That night, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Emily's words over and over in my mind. I think of all the years I spent worrying about her, sacrificing for her, loving her with every fiber of my being. I wonder when that love became something heavy, something she no longer wanted to carry. I wonder if I have failed her, or if she has simply outgrown me. The questions swirl in my mind, unanswered and unanswerable. In the morning, I put on a brave face, smiling as I pour Emily's coffee and ask David if he would like some toast. They barely acknowledge me, lost in their own concerns. I retreat to the garden, seeking solace among the roses, but even there, I cannot escape the sense of unease that has settled over the house. The air feels thick with secrets, and I am suddenly acutely aware of how precarious my position has become. I think of Robert, of the promises we made to each other all those years ago. I promised to take care of our daughter, to give her the best life I could. I kept that promise, even when it cost me more than I ever imagined. But now, as I watch Emily and David move through the house with a sense of ownership that excludes me, I realize that I must also keep a promise to myself. I must find a way to reclaim my dignity, to protect what little I have left. The thought is both frightening and exhilarating. For so long, I have defined myself by what I could give to others. Now, for the first time, I am forced to consider what I might keep for myself. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I cannot go on like this. Something has to change, and soon. As the sun sets over Hawthorne Avenue, casting long shadows across the garden, I sit by the window and watch the world go by. The house is quiet. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I close my eyes and remember the girl I used to be, the woman I became, and the mother I have always tried to be. I do not know what comes next, but I know that I am not finished yet. There is still a part of me that longs for something more, something that belongs to me alone. And for the first time in a long time, I allow myself to hope. It was a Thursday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day when the air in Portland felt gentle and forgiving. I had spent the morning in the garden, coaxing a few stubborn roses into bloom. By the time I came inside, my knees ached, but I felt a quiet satisfaction as I washed the dirt from my hands and set the kettle to boil. Emily and David were both out. Emily had left early for a meeting, her voice trailing behind her as she called out a distracted goodbye. David had gone to the library, or so he said, to look for jobs. The house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I relished the stillness, the rare sense of having the house to myself. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into the armchair by the window, the one with the faded floral upholstery that Robert and I had picked out at a yard sale. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, warming my face. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet seep into my bones. The phone rang, sharp and insistent. I reached for it automatically, glancing at the caller ID. It was Emily. I smiled, expecting to hear her familiar voice or perhaps a request or a reminder. Instead, there was a burst of static, the muffled sound of voices, and then nothing. I waited, thinking she might have pocket dialed me, but after a few seconds, I heard her voice, low and hurried, as if she were speaking to someone nearby. I realized with a jolt that she had not hung up. The phone was still connected, and I was listening in on a conversation not meant for my ears. I should have hung up, but something in her tone made me pause. My heart thudded as I listened. Emily's voice was sharper than usual, tinged with frustration. She was talking to David, her words tumbling out. She spoke of how she couldn't keep doing this, how I was getting worse, forgetting things, leaving the stove on, wandering off in the garden. She was worried something was going to happen. David's voice was calm, saying they had talked about this before. He said it wasn't safe for me to be here alone, and it wasn't fair to them either. They couldn't keep putting their lives on hold. I sat frozen, the cup of tea cooling in my hand. Emily sighed, admitting she didn't know what they were supposed to do. I was her mother, she said. She couldn't just put me somewhere, but David's reply was quiet but firm. He said they didn't have a choice. The house was worth a fortune now. If they sold, they could get me into a good place, somewhere with staff, and finally get their own place. They couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't sustainable. There was a long silence. When Emily spoke again and her voice was brittle, she said I was going to hate her. David's answer was immediate. He said I'd get over it, that I wouldn't even remember. Not really. It was for the best, for everyone. The line went dead, and I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, unable to move. For a long time, I did not feel anything at all. It was as if my mind had gone blank, the words echoing in the empty spaces of my heart. My own daughter, the child I had loved and sacrificed for that was planning to send me away, to sell the house I had built with my own hands, but to erase me from the life I had worked so hard to create. The shock settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to tell myself that I had misunderstood, but the words replayed in my mind, clear and undeniable. She won't even remember. Not really. It's for the best. I thought of all the times I had comforted Emily, all the dreams I had set aside so that she could have a better life. I thought of the promises I had made to Robert, and I felt something inside me break. I do not know how long I sat there, the phone still clutched in my hand. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had heard the betrayal. I looked around the room, at the photographs on the mantel, the worn rug beneath my feet, the familiar clutter of a life lived in service to others. Everything seemed suddenly fragile. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and wandered through the house, touching the things that had once brought me comfort. The kitchen, the living room, the small bedroom at the back of the house, each room was a reminder of what I stood to lose. As the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself in the garden once more, and the air cool and fragrant with the scent of roses. I knelt in the dirt, my hands trembling, and wept for the first time in years. The tears came slowly at first, then in great, racking sobs. I cried for the girl I had been, for the woman I had become, for the mother who had given everything and now found herself unwanted, inconvenient, a problem to be solved. When the tears finally stopped, I felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but a cold, hard resolve. I wiped my face with the hem of my sleeve and sat back on my heels, staring up at the darkening sky. I thought of Robert, of the strength he had always seen in me, and I realized that I could not let Emily and David decide my fate. I had spent my whole life putting others first, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of my family, but now, faced with the prospect of being cast aside, I knew that I had to find a way to protect myself. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. I replayed the conversation over and over, searching for some sign that I had misunderstood, some hint of compassion or regret in Emily's voice. But all I heard was fear and calculation. I thought of the house, of the memories it held, and I knew that I could not bear to see it sold to strangers, to watch my life's work reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. I rose before dawn, unable to sleep, and wandered through the silent house. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, the faintest trace of Robert's aftershave lingering in the hallway. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills and bank statements that had accumulated over the past few months. I realized, with a jolt, that I had no idea what my financial situation truly was. I had always trusted Emily to help with the paperwork, but now I saw that this had been a mistake. I needed to take control, to understand what I had and what I stood to lose. I spent the morning sorting through the papers, organizing them into neat piles, making notes in the margins. It was slow, painstaking work, but it gave me a sense of purpose. Like I found the deed to the house, the mortgage statements, the insurance policies, all the documents that proved this place was mine. I remembered the day Robert and I signed the papers, the way we had celebrated with takeout Chinese food and cheap champagne, dreaming of the life we would build together. I clung to that memory, letting it steady me as I faced the uncertain future. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I made a decision. I would not wait for Emily and David to make their move. I would not be shuffled off to a nursing home. My home sold out from under me, my life reduced to a series of transactions. I would take matters into my own hands, protect what was left of my dignity, and ensure that I had a say in my own fate. The rest of the day passed in a haze of activity. I made lists, checked balances, and began to research my options. I called an old friend from the law firm where I had worked years ago, a woman named Linda, who had always been sharp and discreet. I asked her for advice, careful not to reveal too much, and she promised to look into things for me. I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that I was not entirely alone. That evening, as I sat in the garden watching the last light fade from the sky, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. A future where I was not a burden, not an afterthought, but a woman with agency, with choices. I did not know what that future would look like or how I would get there, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of possibility. The next morning, Emily and David returned home, their voices echoing through the house as they argued about something trivial. I watched them from the kitchen, my heart heavy but resolute. I knew what they were planning, knew that they saw me as an obstacle, a problem to be managed. But I also knew that I was stronger than they realized, that I had survived worse than this. I moved through the day with a new sense of purpose, careful not to let on that anything had changed. I smiled when Emily asked about dinner, nodded when David complained about the slow internet, and kept my own counsel. I listened to their conversations, noting the way they spoke about the house, about their plans for the future, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I was one step ahead. In the evenings, after they had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my papers spread out before me, making plans. I researched senior living communities, not the kind that felt like warehouses for the forgotten, but places where people lived with dignity and independence. I looked into storage units, moving companies, real estate agents. I made lists of what I would take with me, what I would leave behind, but what I would need to start over. There were moments when the enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm me, when I wondered if I was being foolish, if I was simply running away from the inevitable. But then I would remember the sound of Emily's voice on the phone, the cold certainty in David's words, and I would feel the resolve harden in my chest. I had given everything for my family, and now it was time to give something to myself. As the days passed, I found myself growing stronger, more determined. I began to see the house not as a prison, but as a resource, a means to an end. I thought of all the years I had spent tending to its needs, repairing leaky faucets, painting walls, planting gardens. I realized that I had built something of value, something that could give me the freedom I so desperately needed. I did not tell Emily or David about my plans. I kept my own counsel, moving quietly through the house, gathering what I needed, preparing for the day when I would make my move. I knew that they would not understand, that they would see my actions as a betrayal, but I also knew that I could not allow their disappointment or anger to dictate my choices. I had spent too many years living for others. Now, at last, I was living for myself. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I thought of Robert, of the life we had built together, and I knew that he would be proud of me, that I was not running away. I was taking control, reclaiming my life, and forging a new path forward. The betrayal still hurt, a deep ache that would not easily fade, but it no longer defined me. It saw me. I was more than the sum of my sacrifices, more than the mother who had given everything and received so little in return. I was Margaret Turner, and I was not finished yet. After the shock of that overheard conversation, I found myself moving through the house with a new sense of vigilance. Every object, every document, every memory seemed to take on a different weight. I realized how much of my life I had handed over to Emily bank statements, insurance policies, even the deed to the house. I had always trusted her, wanting her to feel capable and included. But now I saw how easily that trust could be twisted or taken for granted. I was determined not to let myself become invisible, not to let my life be managed away by someone else's convenience. I began by gathering every important piece of paperwork I could find. I searched through drawers, boxes in the attic, and the old filing cabinet in the guest room. I found the original deed, still in my name, and the mortgage payoff letter from years ago. There were insurance policies, tax returns, and a folder of correspondence from the city about property assessments. I made careful notes, highlighting anything that seemed important. I wanted to be sure, beyond any doubt, that this house was mine and that no one could take it from me without my consent. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. For so long, I had let others make decisions for me, assuming they knew better or that my role was simply to support what. Now, I saw that I was the only one who could protect what mattered most. I made a list of questions and called Linda, my old friend from the law firm. She listened patiently as I explained my situation, never interrupting or judging. When I finished, she assured me that I was doing the right thing by getting my affairs in order and promised to help me review everything. That evening, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, watching the light fade through the bay window. I thought about Robert, about the years we had spent building this life together. I remembered the sacrifices we had made, the late nights and early mornings, the way we had always found a way to make things work. I wondered what he would think of all this of Emily, of David, of the quiet betrayal that had crept into our home. I missed his steady presence, his calm wisdom, but I also felt him with me, urging me to stand up for myself. The next morning, I met with Linda at her office downtown. She greeted me with a warm hug and ushered me into a small conference room. We went through my documents one by one, and she explained what each meant in plain language. She confirmed that the house was solely in my name and that, legally, Emily and David had no claim to it. She also pointed out a few things I hadn't considered, like updating my will and making sure my power of attorney was someone I truly trusted. I left her office feeling lighter, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted. Back at home, I began to think seriously about my next steps. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever, waiting for Emily and David to make their move. I needed to act before they did, to take control of my own story. I started researching real estate agents, looking for someone with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. I also looked into senior living communities, not the kind that felt like warehouses for the forgotten, but places where people lived with dignity and independence. I wanted a place where I could start over, where I could be myself again. I spent hours online, reading reviews and making notes. I called a few places, asking about availability and waiting lists. Some were too expensive, others too far from the city. But eventually I found a community that felt right, a small, well-kept complex with gardens and walking paths, close enough to the city that I wouldn't feel isolated. I scheduled a tour for the following week, telling Emily only that I was looking into options for the future. She seemed distracted, barely listening, and I felt a pang of sadness at how far apart we had grown. Meanwhile, I continued to gather evidence of my ownership and my intentions. I made copies of all my important documents and stored them in a safe place. I also began keeping a journal, recording everything that happened in the house conversations, decisions, even small slights that might have seemed insignificant before. I wanted a record, not just for myself, but in case I ever needed to prove what had happened. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old photographs, I found a letter from Robert. It was dated the year Emily was born, and in it, he wrote about his hopes for our family and his belief in my strength. Reading his words, I felt a surge of determination. I would not let my life be dictated by fear or by the selfishness of others. I would honor the love we had shared by protecting what we had built. With Linda's help, I contacted a real estate agent named Susan, who came highly recommended. She was professional and kind, never pushing me to make a decision before I was ready. We discussed the market, the value of my home, and the logistics of selling quickly but quietly. Susan assured me that she could find a buyer who would respect my wishes and that the process could be handled discreetly. I felt a sense of relief, knowing I had someone on my side. As the days passed, I began to prepare the house for sale. I sorted through closets, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I packed boxes of memories, photographs, letters, small treasures from years gone by. Each item was a reminder of the life I had lived, the joys and sorrows I had known. It was bittersweet, but also freeing. I realized that I was not leaving my life behind, but carrying it with me in a new form. Emily and David remained oblivious to my plans. They went about their routines, arguing over bills and chores, making vague references to the future without ever including me in their conversations. I watched them with a mixture of sadness and resolve, knowing that I could not change who they were, only how I responded. I no longer felt the need to justify myself or seek their approval. I was doing what I needed to do for myself. One evening, after Emily and David had gone out, I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs on the mantel. I whispered goodbye to each room, thanking it for the memories. In the garden, I breathed in the scent of roses and promised myself I would find beauty wherever I went. I was not running away, I was moving forward. The final step was to set a date for the sale. Susan found a buyer within days, a retired couple looking to downsize, who loved the house and promised to care for the garden. The offer was fair, and the closing could happen quickly. I accepted, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. I told Emily and David only after the papers were signed, presenting it as a decision I had made for my own well-being. They were shocked, of course, but by then, it was too late for them to interfere. In the days leading up to the move, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I packed my things, said my goodbyes, and then made arrangements for my new home, and I left a letter for Emily, explaining my reasons and expressing my hope that she would one day understand. I did not expect forgiveness or even gratitude, only the chance to live the rest of my life on my own terms. On the morning of the move, I stood in the doorway one last time, looking out at the garden, the street, the house that had been my world for so many years. I felt a pang of grief, but also a sense of pride. I had done what I needed to do. I had protected myself, honored my past, and chosen my own future. As I drove away, I did not look back. I carried with me the memories of a life well lived, the strength of a love that had endured, and the quiet certainty that I was, at last, my own person. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to travel. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. But the process of letting go was not as simple as packing boxes and signing papers. Each day, as I sorted through drawers and closets, I found myself pausing over small objects, a faded recipe card in Robert's handwriting, a pressed flower from Emily's childhood, a chipped mug from our first family vacation. These things were more than just possessions. They were fragments of a life, reminders of laughter and loss, of love and disappointment. I allowed myself to grieve for what I was leaving behind. But I also tried to see these moments as stepping stones, not anchors. There were nights when I lay awake, second-guessing my decision. I wondered if I was being too harsh, if I should have tried harder to talk to Emily, to explain how her words had wounded me. But each time I replayed that conversation in my mind, I heard not just her voice, but the cold certainty in David's. I realized that no amount of pleading or explanation would change what they had already decided. I had to accept that their vision of the future did not include me as an equal, only as a responsibility to be managed. I found unexpected comfort in the routines of preparing for the move. I baked bread, tended the garden, and took long walks through the neighborhood, saying silent goodbyes to the places that had shaped my days. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped me one afternoon, concern in her eyes as she asked if everything was all right. I smiled and told her I was making some changes, that it was time for a new chapter. She squeezed my hand and wished me luck, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the kindness of strangers. The day before the move, I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare floors. I paused in the kitchen, remembering the countless meals I had prepared, the birthday cakes and holiday feasts, the quiet mornings with coffee and the newspaper. I stood in the living room, picturing Emily as a little girl, spinning in circles until she collapsed in a fit of giggles. I lingered in the garden, breathing in the scent of roses one last time, and whispered a promise to myself that I would find beauty wherever I went. When the movers arrived, I supervised quietly, making sure that the things I cherished most were handled with care. I watched as my life was loaded into boxes and carried out the door, feeling both lighter and strangely untethered. Emily and David hovered on the sidelines, their faces a mix of confusion and resentment. I offered them a gentle goodbye, wishing them well, and turned away before the tears could fall. Driving to my new home, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The senior community was smaller than my old house, but it was bright and welcoming, with a garden of its own and neighbors who greeted me with smiles. I unpacked my things slowly, arranging photographs and mementos in places of honor. I allowed myself to hope that, in time, this new place would feel like home. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a new rhythm. I joined a book club, took up painting again, and spent afternoons walking the garden paths. I discovered that I was not alone. Many of my neighbors had stories like mine, tales of families grown distant, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of disappointment. We shared laughter and tears, and I found comfort in their company. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window and look out at the city lights, thinking of Emily, and wondering if she would ever understand why I had done what I did. I hoped that one day she might see that my decision was not an act of anger, but of self-preservation and love. I wanted her to know that I had chosen to live, not just to exist. The pain of betrayal lingered, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the sum of my sacrifices, more than the mother who had given everything and received so little in return. I was Margaret Turner, and I was not finished yet. The days leading up to my departure felt both surreal and strangely peaceful, as if I were floating through someone else's life. I moved quietly through the house, packing my belongings with a care that bordered on reverence. Oh, and each item I wrapped and placed in a box seemed to carry the weight of decades photographs of Emily as a child. Robert's old books, the faded quilt my mother had sewn for me when I first left home. I found myself pausing often, letting my fingers linger on the fabric of a dress or the spine of a novel, remembering the moments that had shaped me. There was a kind of mourning in the process, but also a sense of gratitude. I was not just leaving a house, I was honoring a life. I tried to keep my preparations discreet. Emily and David were preoccupied with their own routines, and I took advantage of their absences to sort through closets and drawers. I made piles: what to keep, what to donate, what to leave behind. The hardest decisions were not about possessions, but about memories. Some things I could not bear to part with, even if they served no practical purpose. Others, I realized, had lost their meaning long ago. I let myself cry when I needed to, but I also allowed myself to feel relief. The act of letting go was painful, but it was also liberating. One afternoon, as I was packing the last of the kitchenware, Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by. She had noticed the moving boxes and came to offer help, her eyes full of concern. I assured her that I was all right, that I was making a change for myself, and she hugged me tightly. Her kindness touched me more than I expected. I promised to keep in touch, though we both knew that life has a way of pulling people apart. Still, her visit reminded me that I was not as alone as I sometimes felt. The logistics of the move were daunting, but I approached them methodically. I arranged for a moving company to come early in the morning, and I reserved a small storage unit for the things I could not take with me right away. I made list utilities to cancel, addresses to update, keys to return. I even baked a batch of bread for the movers, a small gesture of thanks for their help. The act of planning gave me a sense of control, a way to channel my anxiety into something productive. As the day of the move approached, I found myself thinking more and more about how I would say goodbye. I wanted to leave something behind for Emily and David, not an explanation, but a statement of my own truth. I sat at the kitchen table late one night, the house silent around me, then wrote a letter. I chose my words carefully, wanting to be honest but not cruel. I told them that I had overheard their conversation, that I understood their fears and frustrations, but that I could not allow myself to be treated as a burden. I explained that the decision to sell the house and move on was mine alone, and that I hoped, in time, they would come to see it as an act of love for myself, not a rejection of them. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, writing their names on the front in my neatest handwriting. I left it on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl where Emily would be sure to see it. The act of writing the letter felt final, as if I were closing a chapter of my life. I did not know how they would react, but I knew that I had said what needed to be said. The morning of the move dawned clear and bright. I woke early, unable to sleep, and made myself a cup of tea. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, saying silent goodbyes to the spaces that had sheltered me for so long. I paused in the garden, breathing in the scent of roses, and let the sunlight warm my face. I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation, grief and hope. I was leaving behind so much, but I was also stepping into something new. The movers arrived promptly, and I directed them as they loaded the boxes and furniture into the truck. I watched as my life was carried out the door, piece by piece, and felt a strange sense of detachment. It was as if I were watching a play, the final act unfolding before me. When everything was packed, I locked the door and slipped the keys into my purse. I took one last look at the house, the garden, the street where I had lived for so many years, and then I walked away. My new apartment was smaller, but it felt fresh and full of possibility. The first night, I unpacked only the essentials, a few clothes, my favorite books, a photograph of Robert and Emily. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on, and allowed myself to feel proud. I had done something difficult, something brave. I had chosen myself. In the days that followed, I settled into a new routine. I explored the neighborhood, found a cozy coffee shop, and introduced myself to the neighbors. I joined a book club at the community center and signed up for a painting class. I discovered that I enjoyed the freedom of living alone, the quiet mornings and the unhurried evenings. I missed the house sometimes, and I missed Robert, but I did not miss the feeling of being invisible. I checked in with Linda, who assured me that the sale had gone smoothly and that the proceeds were safely in my account. I felt a sense of security I had not known in years. I made plans for the future, small trips I wanted to take, hobbies I wanted to pursue, friendships I hoped to nurture. To realize that I was not just rebuilding my life, I was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined. One afternoon, as I was unpacking a box of old letters, I found one from Emily, written when she was away at college. She had thanked me for everything I had done for her, for the sacrifices I had made, for the love I had given so freely. Reading her words, I felt a pang of longing, but also a sense of closure. I knew that I had been a good mother, that I had given her everything I could. Whatever happened next, I could live with that. A week after the move, I received a call from Mrs. Patterson. She told me that Emily and David had come by the house, could say, expecting to find me there, Bimby. She said they had been surprised, even angry, when they realized I was gone. I thanked her for letting me know, but I did not feel guilty. I had left them a letter, and I had left them the chance to make their own choices. My life was no longer theirs to manage. I spent more time in the garden at my new place, planting herbs and flowers in pots on the balcony. The act of nurturing something new felt symbolic, a way of reminding myself that growth was still possible. I made friends with a woman named Grace, who lived down the hall and shared my love of mystery novels. We spent afternoons trading books and stories, laughing over cups of tea. I found myself looking forward to each day, to the small pleasures and the quiet joys. Sometimes, late at night, I would think of Emily and wonder if she would ever understand why I had done what I did. I hoped that, in time, she might see that my decision was not an act of anger, but of self-preservation and love. I wanted her to know that I had chosen to live, and not just to exist. The pain of betrayal lingered, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the sum of my sacrifices, more than the mother who had given everything and received so little in return. I was Margaret Turner, and I was not finished yet. As the weeks passed, I found myself growing stronger, more confident. I took up painting again, filling canvases with color and light. I joined a walking group and explored the city's parks and gardens. I volunteered at the local library, reading to children on Saturday mornings. I discovered that I had a talent for making people laugh, for putting them at ease. I realized that I was not just rebuilding my life, I was creating something entirely new. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the city, I felt a deep sense of peace. I thought of Robert, of the life we had built together, and I knew that he would be proud of me. I was not running away. I was taking control, reclaiming my life, and forging a new path forward. I knew there would be difficult days ahead, moments of doubt and loneliness. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them. I had survived heartbreak and disappointment, and I had come out the other side. I was not afraid of the future. I was ready for whatever came next. The letter I had left for Emily and David was my final gift to them, a chance to understand, to forgive, to move on. Whether they chose to accept it was up to them. I had done what I needed to do. I had chosen myself. And in doing so, I had found a kind of freedom I had never known before. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a quiet joy settle over me. I was no longer anyone's burden. I was my own person, and my story was far from over. But the process of settling into my new life was not without its challenges. There were mornings when I woke up disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was. The apartment was smaller, quieter, and sometimes the silence pressed in on me. I missed the familiar creak of the old floorboards, the way the afternoon sun slanted through the bay window, the sound of Emily's laughter echoing down the hallway. Yet, I reminded myself, this was a new chapter, and I had the power to fill it with new memories. I made a point to stay active, to keep my mind and body engaged. I signed up for a yoga class at the community center, even though I had never tried it before. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Carla, encouraged me to go at my own pace. I found that I enjoyed the gentle stretches, the focus on breathing, the camaraderie of the group. It was another small step toward reclaiming my independence. I also began volunteering at a local food pantry, helping to organize donations and prepare meals for families in need. The work was humbling and rewarding, and it gave me a sense of purpose to be. I met people from all walks of life, each with their own story of struggle and resilience. Their courage inspired me, and I felt grateful to be able to give back in some small way. As the seasons changed, I watched the city transform. The trees outside my window turned gold and crimson, and the air grew crisp. I spent afternoons walking through the park, collecting leaves and acorns, marveling at the beauty of the world around me. I realized that I was not just surviving, I was thriving. Occasionally, I would receive a card or a phone call from Mrs. Patterson, checking in to see how I was doing. Her friendship was a comfort, a reminder that I was still connected to the world I had left behind. I wrote back, sharing stories of my new adventures, and she always replied with words of encouragement. One day, as I was tending to my balcony garden, I received a letter from Emily. Her handwriting was familiar, but the words were hesitant, uncertain. She wrote that she had read my letter, that she was struggling to understand my decision, but that she hoped I was happy. She apologized for the things she had said, for the way she had made me feel. Reading her words, I felt a wave of relief and forgiveness. I knew that healing would take time, but this was a beginning. I wrote back, telling her that I loved her, that I was proud of her, and that I hoped we could find our way back to each other. I did not dwell on the past or demand apologies. I simply offered her the same unconditional love I always had. It was enough. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt a sense of contentment I had not known in years. I had faced my fears, made difficult choices, and come out stronger. I was no longer defined by my role as a mother or a wife, but by the woman I had become. I was Margaret Turner, and my story was still unfolding. The first sign that Emily and David had finally returned to the old house came not from them, but from Mrs. Patterson. She called me one afternoon, her voice a mixture of concern and curiosity, to let me know that my daughter and son in law had arrived, suitcases in hand, expecting to find me waiting for them. Instead, they found an empty house, the furniture gone, the rooms echoing with absence, and a single envelope on the kitchen counter. I could almost picture the confusion on Emily's face, the way her brow would furrow as she tried to make sense of what had happened. I thanked Mrs. Plow Patterson for letting me know, and after we hung up, I sat for a long time by my window, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over my new neighborhood. I imagined the scene unfolding in the house I had left behind. Emily would have called my name, her voice echoing through the empty rooms, growing sharper with each unanswered call. David, ever the pragmatist, would have checked the closets, the garage, perhaps even the mailbox, looking for some sign of where I had gone. Eventually, they would have found the letter I left for them, propped against the fruit bowl, my handwriting neat and steady. I wondered if Emily's hands trembled as she opened it, if David read over her shoulder, his face tightening as he realized what I had done. I had written the letter with care, choosing my words as if they were stones I was laying across a river, hoping to build a path to understanding. I told them that I had overheard their conversation, that I knew about their plans for the house and for me. I explained that my decision to sell and move on was not an act of anger, but of self-preservation. I wrote that I loved them both, but I could not allow myself to be treated as a burden. Nor could I watch my life's work be reduced to a transaction. I wished them well, and I hoped that, in time, they would come to see my choice as an act of love for myself, not a rejection of them. For days after Mrs. Patterson's call, I waited for some word from Emily or David. I checked my phone more often than I cared to admit, half expecting a message, a voicemail, even a letter, but there was only silence. I told myself that they needed time to process, to grieve, to be angry. I tried not to let the quiet eat away at my resolve. I reminded myself that I had done what I needed to do, that I had chosen my own happiness for the first time in years. It was Mrs. Patterson again who told me about the fallout. She called one evening, her voice low, to say that Emily and David had been seen arguing in the driveway, their voices carrying across the street. Neighbors had gathered in small knots, watching as the couple tried to make sense of their new reality. Some of the neighbors, Mrs. Patterson said, were sympathetic, but others were less forgiving. There was talk of how Emily and David had treated me, of the way they had planned to sell the house and put me in a home. The story spread quickly, as stories do in neighborhoods where people have lived side by side for decades. I felt a strange mix of emotions as I listened to Mrs. Patterson recount the gossip. Part of me was relieved that the truth was out, that I was no longer the only one carrying the weight of what had happened. Another part of me felt a pang of sadness for Emily, for the way her reputation was being picked apart by people who had once watched her grow up. I did not want her to be shamed or ostracized, but I also knew that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we teach ourselves. In the days that followed, I heard more stories from Mrs. Patterson and occasionally from other old friends who still lived nearby. Emily and David struggled to find a new place to live, their plans for the future upended by my decision. The house, now empty and echoing, was a stark reminder of what they had lost: not just a home, but a sense of certainty, of inheritance, of control. I wondered if they blamed each other, or if they had finally realized how fragile the bonds of family can be when trust is broken. I tried not to dwell on their struggles, but it was impossible not to think of Emily, of the little girl she had once been. I remembered her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she used to curl up beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder. I wondered if she remembered those moments, or if they had been buried beneath years of resentment and expectation. I hoped that, in time, she would find her way back to herself, and perhaps to me. Meanwhile, my own life continued to unfold in quiet, unexpected ways. I found comfort in the routines I had built for myself: morning walks in the park, afternoons spent painting or reading, evenings shared with new friends over cups of tea. I discovered that I was not alone in my experience. Many of the women I met at the community center had stories of their own: tales of children grown distant, of families fractured by pride or misunderstanding. We shared our grief and our hope, and in doing so, we found a kind of healing. One afternoon, as I was tending to my balcony garden, Grace stopped by with a plate of cookies and a sympathetic smile. She had heard, through the grapevine, about my family drama, as she called it, and wanted to make sure I was all right. I told her the truth, that I was sad, but also relieved, and that I was learning to let go of things I could not change. She nodded, squeezing my hand, and then told me that I was braver than I knew. The social fallout from my decision rippled outward in ways I had not anticipated. Emily and David found themselves the subject of whispers and sideways glances at the grocery store, at church, even at the local coffee shop. Some people were openly critical, others quietly supportive. But the sense of judgment was inescapable. I wondered if Emily resented me for exposing her, or if she understood that the consequences were the result of her own choices. I received a letter from Emily about a month after the move. Her handwriting was shaky, the words hesitant. She wrote that she was struggling to understand why I had done what I did, that she felt betrayed and abandoned. She asked if I could ever forgive her, if there was a way back from what had happened. Reading her letter, I felt a wave of sadness, but also a glimmer of hope. I wrote back, telling her that I loved her, that forgiveness was not a single act but a process, and that I hoped we could find our way back to each other in time. David never wrote, but I did not expect him to. He had always been more comfortable with numbers than with feelings, more at ease with plans than with uncertainty. I hoped that, like in his own way, he would come to understand that what had happened was not just about money or property, but about respect, about the right to choose one's own path. As the weeks turned into months, the story of my departure faded from the neighborhood gossip. New dramas took its place: an unexpected pregnancy, a neighbor's illness, a long awaited wedding. Life moved on, as it always does. I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future, about the possibilities that still lay ahead. I continued to build my new life, piece by piece. I took a trip to the coast with Grace, walking along the beach and collecting shells like we were girls again. I started a small painting group at the community center, sharing my love of color and light with others. I volunteered at the library, reading to children and helping them discover the magic of stories. I found joy in the small things: a cup of coffee on a rainy morning, the laughter of friends, the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. There were still moments of loneliness, of course. There were nights when I missed the sound of Emily's voice, the comfort of Robert's arms, the sense of belonging that comes from being part of a family, but those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by a growing sense of peace. I had survived heartbreak and disappointment, and I had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, more myself. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I realized that I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had chosen to keep: my dignity, my independence, my hope. I was Margaret Turner, and my story was still unfolding. The consequences of my decision had been far reaching, touching not just my own life, but the lives of those around me. Emily and David had been forced to confront their own choices, to reckon with the reality of what they had done. The neighborhood had been reminded that families are fragile, that love is not a guarantee, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to choose ourselves. I did not know what the future held for Emily and me, or if we would ever find our way back to the closeness we once shared. But I knew that I had done what I needed to do, that I had honored my own needs and desires, and that I was finally at peace with my choices. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. I was no longer anyone's burden. I was my own person, and my story was far from over. The months after my move unfolded with a quiet steadiness, each day bringing a little more lightness to my heart. I found myself growing into my new life, not as a mother or a wife, but as Margaret Turner, simply myself. The apartment, once unfamiliar, became a place of comfort. I filled it with small joys, a vase of fresh flowers on the table, the scent of bread baking in the oven, the gentle hum of the city outside my window. I learned the rhythms of my new neighborhood, the best time to visit the market, which streets were shaded in the afternoon, and which coffee shop made the strongest tea. I kept busy, not to distract myself from loneliness, but because I was genuinely curious about the world around me. I joined a painting class and found that my hands, though older, still remembered the pleasure of color and brush. I volunteered at the library, reading stories to children, their laughter echoing in the quiet rooms. I made friends, real friends, not just acquaintances, women who had also started over, who understood the bittersweet freedom of beginning again. We shared meals, stories, and sometimes our fears. In their company, I felt seen in a way I hadn't for years. There were moments, of course, when the past tugged at me. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I would think of Robert, of the life we had built together, and feel a pang of longing. I missed the sound of his voice, the warmth of his hand in mine. I missed Emily, too. Though our relationship was still tentative, marked by careful letters and the occasional phone call. We were both learning how to speak to each other again, to find a new way forward that was not built on obligation or guilt, but on respect and honesty. I hoped, in time, we might find our way back to something like closeness. One afternoon, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip behind the city skyline, I realized how much I had changed. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give my life meaning. I was not living for the approval of a daughter or the memory of a husband. I was living for myself, for the small pleasures and quiet triumphs that made each day worth waking up for. I had learned to forgive not just Emily, but myself. I forgave myself for the years I had spent trying to be everything to everyone, for the mistakes I had made, for the times I had stayed silent when I should have spoken. The world felt wider now, full of possibility. I planned a trip to the coast with Grace, eager to see the ocean again, to feel the salt air on my skin. I started a new painting, this one brighter than the last, full of gold and blue and hope. I wrote letters to old friends, rekindling connections I had let slip away. I even began to dream again, not of what might have been, but of what could still be. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found myself laughing more easily, sleeping more soundly, waking each morning with a sense of anticipation. I was not naive. I knew there would be hard days ahead, moments of doubt and sadness, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them. I had built a life for myself, one choice at a time, and I was proud of what I had created. Looking back, I saw that the hardest part had not been leaving the house or even letting go of Emily. The hardest part had been believing that I deserved happiness, that I was allowed to choose myself. Now, as I stood at the threshold of this new chapter, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my bones because I was not finished yet. My story was still unfolding, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what would happen next. I closed my eyes and breathed in the evening air, feeling the world turn gently around me. I was Margaret Turner. I was free, and I was home. But life, I discovered, has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. One Saturday morning, as I was leaving the market with a bag of fresh peaches, I ran into Mrs. Patterson, who had come to visit her niece in the city. We sat together at a small cafe, sharing stories and laughter, and I realized how much I valued the connections I had made over the years, both old and new. She told me about the neighborhood, how things had changed since I left, and how people still asked about me from time to time. I felt a gentle warmth in knowing I had not been forgotten. Later that week, I received a letter from Emily. Her words were softer now, less guarded. She wrote about her new job, about the challenges she and David were facing, and about how she was beginning to understand the choices I had made. She thanked me for my honesty, for the letter I had left behind, and for teaching her that it was never too late to start over. I read her letter several times, each time feeling a little more of the old hurt slip away. I wrote back, telling her that I loved her, that I was proud of her resilience, and that I hoped we could see each other soon. I began to notice small changes in myself. I was more patient, more willing to forgive, not just others, but myself. Stuff. I found joy in the simplest things: a bird singing outside my window, the taste of a perfectly ripe peach, the way the light danced on the walls in the late afternoon. I realized that happiness was not something to be chased, but something to be noticed, to be welcomed in the quiet moments of everyday life. As spring turned to summer, I hosted a small gathering for my new friends. We sat on the balcony, sharing food and stories as the sun set over the city. There was laughter, and even a few tears, but mostly there was a sense of belonging. I looked around at the faces of these women, each of us carrying our own stories of loss and renewal, and I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me here. I knew that life would continue to bring its share of challenges, but I also knew that I was ready for them. I had learned to trust myself, to listen to my own needs, and to embrace the unknown with an open heart. I was no longer defined by my past, but by the choices I made each day to live fully and honestly. As I watched the city lights flicker on that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. I was Margaret Turner, and I was finally truly home.